Hi everybody, my name is Joanne Lydon and I'm chairing today's session, Eugenics Thinking and Indigenous Australia. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we're holding this series of events and I'm speaking from the traditional country of the Wodja Noongar people of southwestern Western Australia. So I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past. This panel series explores the relationship between eugenics thought and Indigenous Australia. So eugenics has not really been a major frame for thinking about Indigenous history and policy in Australia. So I'd like to thank my colleague Rob Wilson, whose idea this series has been and who has really played the major role in organising it. We have a slightly innovative format today. We have three panellists, each of whom will present from their perspective, and there'll be just one or two questions following each one, followed by a more interactive stage. We will then be able to go into chat rooms so that all of us in the audience and presenters can talk to one another for maybe 15 minutes, and then we'll come back for a final interactive session. I will just begin. For those unfamiliar with this school of thought, the term eugenics was coined by Francis Galton in 1883 in his book, Inquiries into Human Faculty and Its Development, as what he defined as questions bearing on what is termed in Greek eugenics, namely good in stock, hereditarily endowed with noble qualities. He suggested that the term expressed the science of improving stock, which is by no means confined to questions of judicious mating, but which, especially in the case of man, takes cognizance of all influences that tend to give the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable. Later in the same book, he was to argue that there exists a sentiment, for the most part quite unreasonable, against the gradual extinction of an inferior race. So we can see already that from its inception, eugenics was founded on the notion of a hierarchy of races. Eugenics advocates were implicated in Nazism and the Holocaust. The goal of eugenics is intergenerational human improvement, increasing the balance of desirable over undesirable traits in human populations across generations. The means is the use of science, technology and social policy in identifying such traits and in promoting improve future generations. For eugenists, the solution to many social problems lay in encouraging the fit to reproduce and ensuring that the unfit could not. Thus, over time, unfitness could be bred out of the population, ensuring social progress and prosperity. Most eugenists supported policies for the permanent segregation of the unfit in institutions to minimise their chances of reproduction. Countries such as Britain, Canada and France and all states of Australia legislated for the permanent segregation of what they called mental defectives by the late 1920s. A minority supported the more radical solution of sterilisation, a policy that found favour in Germany and at least 13 states of the USA during the 1930s. A sterilisation bill passed in the lower house in Western Australia in 1929, only to be defeated in the upper house. At this time, the Western Australian Minister for Health, Selby Munsey, quoted from the eugenicist James Pearl's 1926 book, which was titled Today and Tomorrow, the Testing Period of the White Race, that Australians still have it in their power by excluding colour, limiting entry to the best whites and preventing the unfit from breeding to become and remain about the finest white strain in the world. A number of our leading historians have considered the Australian history of the eugenics movement. Stephen Garton, for example, has traced shifts in eugenicist thought as it filtered into Australia during the 1890s and gained in popularity during the interwar years. So Garton has demonstrated the elasticity of eugenics rhetoric, but also its limits. Yet, as Warwick Anderson notes, One of the more distinctive features of the history of racial thought in Australia is the concentration on medical and geographical investigation of white bodies and white mentalities in what was initially experienced as a foreign and presumably hostile environment. So, while the historical study of 20th century racial hygiene and eugenics advocacy in Australia is well advanced, as Anderson notes, studies of eugenics rarely refer to scientific investigation of Aboriginality. And indeed, there has been some debate regarding whether policies applied to Indigenous Australians should be termed eugenicist. In their response to the Aboriginal problem, as it was termed, all Australian states, except Tasmania, but particularly the Northern Territory and Western Australia, developed policies of biological absorption, aiming to breed out the colour and produce a white population through intermarriage. However, Russell McGregor pointed to a long history of Australian eugenist hostility toward Aboriginal white intermixing, and has argued that while absorptionism and eugenism certainly held some characteristics in common, notably their advocacy of reproductive management as a solution to social problems, the goal of absorptionist policies to breed out the colour was quite distinct from the eugenist aim of genetic enhancement. So for McGregor, eugenicist thought constituted mere fragments of larger arguments based on other grounds. Yet he also acknowledged that those few absorptionists who were bold enough to suggest some positive racial results from the blend. So the medical administrator Cecil Cook, for example, so Cook served as the Chief Medical Officer and Protector of Aborigines in the Northern Territory from 1927, claimed that the Aboriginal inheritance brings to the hybrid definite qualities of value: intelligence, stamina, resource, high resistance to the influence of tropical environment, and the character of pigmentation, which he suggested would protect against cancer, for example. But of course, as we know, it's not just about how closely local theorists and policymakers adhered to a Northern Hemisphere defined intellectual school, but rather it's about the ways in which they translated the ideas into local terms and practices. So this is what Mike Anderson sort of talks about as a kind of vernacularisation of these theories. Further, despite its stated goal of improvement, eugenics often normalised the dehumanisation and disposability of those with less desirable traits, those deemed unfit. Practices, institutions and policies such as segregation, marriage restriction laws, compulsory sterilisation, immigration restriction laws are part of the recognised eugenic past in many countries. Child removal practices, residential schools and some uses of reproductive technologies, both to select embryos with desired traits and to terminate fetuses with undesirable traits, have all been claimed to manifest eugenic thinking, as Rob Wilson has suggested. In this panel series, we expand discussion from the strictly intellectual parameters of eugenist thinking to consider their impact. Several Australian historians have shown how such theories shaped Indigenous policy and experience. Today, we're privileged to hear from three scholars with unique perspectives on the effects of eugenist thinking on Indigenous people. So first, I'd like to introduce Joanne Faulkner. Joanne is a settler coloniser woman living on Gadigal and Wongal land and working on Darug land. She's an ARC Future Fellow in Cultural Studies at Macquarie University, and her project analyses representations of Aboriginal children and childhood within Australian settler colonial culture. She is the author of Young and Free, Post-Colonial Ontologies of Childhood, Memory and History in Australia, published in 2016, and in 2011, The Importance of Being Innocent, Why We Worry About Children. So her paper is titled Eugenic Thinking in Australian Popular Culture, Residues of the Stolen Generations. So I'll now hand over to Joanne.
Thank you, Jane. I'm just going to share my screen. Here we go. Okay. Yes, and thank you, Rob and Jane, for inviting me on this panel. And it's just such a privilege to be speaking on a panel with Lynette Russell and Peter Reid. So I just want to acknowledge before I start that the Gadigal and Wangal lands on which I live, sovereignty has never been ceded, and pay respects to elders past and present. So today I want to address how mainstream Australian habits of representing Aboriginal people continue to express eugenic thinking from Australia's early to mid-20th century, and particularly the techniques of controlled miscegenation and forced removal of children, now known as the stolen generations, and how this was facilitated by a regime of classification of Aboriginal peoples by blood quantum. So this relative continuity of habits of thought is reflected in the fact that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are still so vastly overrepresented in child protection and carceral systems. So our colonial history is thus also our colonial present. And elements of this present may be characterised in terms of eugenic thinking. So my aim today is to draw out how a specifically Australian logistics of eugenics has been and continues to be supported by popular cultural representations of Aboriginal people. Okay, so I'm just going to go through some kind of key elements of eugenic thought that characterise Australian kind of culture. And these were best articulated, or almost systematically articulated, by A.O. Neville, the Chief Protector of Aborigines in Western Australia from 1915 to 1940. Okay, so these principles are first the notion that so-called full-blooded Aboriginal people would die out of their own accord because they cannot compete with modern Europeans. And this is both a genetic and a cultural claim that he's making, invoking the idea of an evolutionary ladder, as well as the notion of cultural weakness that's inherent to Aboriginal peoples. And essentially what this view does is it distances colonisers from harm to Aboriginal flourishing. So he argued that depopulation of Aboriginal people is due to factors that are intrinsic to Aboriginal culture rather than connected to the actions and activities of colonisers. And in particular, Neville identifies intertribal warfare and also what he sees as dangerous cultural practices as responsible for a decline in numbers of Aboriginal people. Okay, so secondly, the idea that Aboriginal people are also Caucasian, so rather than Negroid, so come from the same root stock essentially as white people. And this is an idea he gets from Alfred Russel Wallace. So this kind of idea engendered an optimism about a program to breed out the colour. The idea is that there's a less of a risk of atavism or throwing back to black skin through the subsequent generations. And this was, seen as a problem in the US. Along with this is the idea that Aboriginality is kind of itself not very strong, either genetically or culturally, and so Aboriginal people will be easily absorbed by the people of the Commonwealth, so to speak, presumed to be white. And thirdly, this idea, this kind of fetishisation, I guess, of white blood and the idea that white blood purifies the child of their Aboriginality, so that they become less Aboriginal as they through the generations, this idea kind of folds into this view that there's an enhanced capacity for children of less blood quantum, so we're talking like in language of half caste, then quarter caste, octoroon, that as they kind of move through these generations, there's more of a capacity to be civilised. And this is coupled with practices of taking children into white homes and into institutions, and the idea that this is kind of inherently improvement for those children. And I'm just going to, I guess, illustrate, I guess, the zealousness of Neville's opinions in this regard, and kind of the kind of it's framed in humanitarian ways, but it's also quite dark in the way he expresses this. So he says, Indigenous primitive peoples seem to reach a 0 hour, from which point they are faced either with extinction or the acceptance of new methods which may save them. These methods being European. Our Aborigines have surely reached that stage, and we must see to it that their acceptance of our way of life raises them to new standards of usefulness, health and happiness, and the abandonment of all that is evil in a culture which is outworn and often repugnant. Okay, so that gives you a sense of the affective dimension of this. Okay, so if we turn to, we turn to popular culture, I want to focus a little bit on the film Jeddah from 1955, which made explicit how mid-20th century Australians understood the colonial relation, and it articulated racial stereotypes of Aboriginality that continue to be drawn on in practices of representation today and of racist behaviour. So it's a highly influential text and still reverberates through our media and institutions. And I'll just very briefly give a précis of the story of Jeddah. So it's set in the outback, where it's understood in settler colonial imagination, authentic Aboriginal people live. Sarah McCann is a white woman whose baby dies, but is replaced by a black baby, Jeddah, whose own mother has died in labour. Sarah raises her as white, but in adolescence, Jeddah is drawn to a tribal man, Marbuk, who bewitches and abducts her. She is deemed the wrong skin, and so his elders curse him to death. The film culminates with Marbuk taking Jeddah over a cliff and to both their deaths. And the film is narrated by Jeddah's fiancé, Joe, who identifies himself as a half-caste and has also been raised by the McCanns and is kind of a success story in assimilation. And so the different kind of Aboriginal characters within the film are kind of classified differently in terms of blood quantum and their potentialities. So Jeddah exemplifies several narrative techniques that are commonly deployed in treatments of Aboriginal content. And these narrative techniques are hand-wringing over the question of the place of Aboriginal people in modern Australia. And in Jeddah, this kind of famously is staged through debates about the destiny of the Aboriginal race and the merits of policies of assimilation. And it's often sometimes interpreted as an anti-assimilationist text, but I would question that. So I don't know, we might talk about that later in discussion if you like. Okay, so a second technique is the deflection of responsibility for the Aboriginal problems, so construed, from colonisers' presence and activities. And in Jeddah we see this through the erasure of the event of removal. So where Jeddah's mother dies in labour and her father and other Aboriginal people seem uninterested in caring for her. So she's it's kind of just a necessary progression that she's raised by white people. It's not construed as a stolen generation story. We also see this kind of deflection in the ultimate deaths of Marbuk and Jeddah. They die because of Aboriginal law. And this fits a narrative that decline is intrinsic to Aboriginal culture rather than something that is a factor of the processes of colonisation. And thirdly, whites position themselves in these narratives as holding the solution to the problem, so as rescuers. And in Jeddah, we see this again. Jeddah's a stolen generation story, but it's kind of transposed to become a story of rescue. And we also see that no Aboriginal characters are kind of engaged in discussing what would be best for the future of Aboriginal people in Australia. This is a conversation between white property owners. So these techniques of colonial power extend to news commentary on Aboriginal people today. And so I'm just going to run through briefly a couple of examples that are quite recent. So the first was in March 2018 on Channel 7's Sunrise program. A panel of non-Indigenous and non-expert commentators pontificated about the risk to Aboriginal children of being raped by members of their own community. A presenter, Sam Armitage, erroneously claimed children at risk could only be placed with relatives or other Indigenous families. So that discussion turned to the question of whether child protection was pandering to PC qualms that put children in danger, or whether children would be better off with white families. And this is a misconstrual of the application of the Aboriginal child placement principle, which is not rigorously applied in most states and territories. Okay, so the segment culminated in the panellist Prue McSween on the left there, declaring that just like the first stolen generations, children should be removed from their parents. And she questioned the harm done to Aboriginal people by policies of removal. Okay, the second incident around a year later was on Channel 10's Studio 10, and was not initially about children or children's welfare, but instead concerned rallies against Australia Day or Invasion Day. So January 26th has become a day to raise consciousness about what it means to celebrate colonial dispossession. And in 2019, the marches grew large enough to attract mainstream media attention. Veteran television presenter Kerry-Anne Kennelly, again on the left, deflected discussion from protesters' claims by accusing them of not caring about Aboriginal women and children who are, she claimed, being raped and abused in, quote, the outback. Yet the outrage that followed was because fellow panellist Yumi Steins had warned Kennelly her remarks made her sound racist. The station and much of the public sided with Kennelly, who was seen to be expressing concern for Aboriginal women and children, whereas Steins had committed the high crime of calling out racism, which is far worse than actually saying racist things, apparently. So these events, I just want to, I guess, remind people of these principles here. These events recapitulate the arguments of Neville, as also elaborated by Jeddah, that any strife experienced by First Peoples is intrinsic to their culture and nature, and that colonisers are positioned as rescuers, or at worst as indifferent, but certainly never as only a causal relation to Indigenous issues. And a contemporary kind of twist on that is that that Aboriginal people, passed in the old language as full-blooded, only live in the outback. And so any Aboriginal people who are concerned with politics and justice are kind of not Aboriginal. Okay, so I just want to end with the words of Darumbal and South Sea Islander woman Amy Macquarie, who I think really well in this article cited on here sums up the dual logics of settler colonisation at play here, and particularly both the distancing of the coloniser from responsibility and characterising Aboriginal problems as intrinsic to the nature of Aboriginality. Okay, so I'll give her the last word. The white witness becomes a war correspondent reporting on the civil war between black and black. He or she is the credible observer who has ventured from the borders of respectability to the borderlands of out there, most commonly remote Australia, where blackness is seen as savage and violent and the victims are given no voice, no agency, no humanity. This is the war the white witness will tell you about, one focused on dysfunction and hopelessness and told with the veneer of impartiality, because to tell it like this is to ensure the white witness is only the correspondent and never an active player. Okay, I'll stop sharing. Okay,
well, thank you very much, Jo. And I'm sure we'd all be applauding if this was not a virtual event. Thank you for that. That was really fascinating. Perhaps I could just start with a quick question. I thought you said that the film was anti-assimilationist. It was not. Could you just clarify that? Because I have come across the argument from Paul Burns, for example, that the film has been can be read as in both ways. You know, both as emphasising the idea that the races should be kept apart, as well as almost against that plot, emphasising the kind of the compulsion and the attractiveness of Aboriginality. So just wondering whether you could clarify that a little bit, please.
Yeah, it's an extremely ambivalent text, and there's so many ways of interpreting it. So yeah, it is kind of seen as, you know, the first film to take seriously Aboriginal people and the inner life of Aboriginal people. I see it as not anti-assimilationist because of the way that it seems to be constrained by those ideas about blood quantum. And so, you know, like Jeddah was never going to be able to be assimilated because she was full blood Aboriginal. Whereas Joe, who talked about himself as a half caste, was this kind of, you know, like model citizen. Was even more kind of assimilated in a way than the white people in the film. He had a Oxford accent and was very proper. So yeah, I find it it was staged these conversations between Sarah McCann and Doug McCann about what's best for Aboriginal people. Should she be allowed to participate in the cultural life of her tribe, or kind of sheltered and raised white. But I think the fact that it kind of is so clear that part of that story is that she's a full-blooded Aboriginal, and that's why she can't be assimilated. It means it folds back into that old discourse.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. So I was particularly struck by your comments, your quotation first from A.O. Neville about the kind of the evil, the dangerous cultural practices of Aboriginal people, and that the way that they were echoed all those years later by Kerry Ann Kennelly. And so I think that was so effective to show those continuing ideas. So thank you for that. I'm just going to see whether there are any questions from the audience at this point. If you could, I think we have 58 members of the audience at the moment. If anyone has a question, could you just perhaps raise your hand or make a comment in in the chat or the Q&A. So it doesn't really matter. But if there are no immediate questions, we might actually move on to our second speaker. It's 1:30. So thank you, Jo, and I'll move on now to Lynette Russell. So Professor Lynette Russell is an award-winning historian and Indigenous Studies scholar. She's currently a Kathleen Fitzpatrick Laureate Fellow at Monash University. She is an elected member of IATSIS and a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences of Australia, the Australian Academy of the Humanities, the Royal Historical Society and Royal Anthropological Institute. She's the author or editor of 17 volumes with several more in train. Lynette is the only Australian scholar to be elected to both the Royal Historical Society of London and the Royal Anthropological Institute of London. In addition, she has held 2 fellowships at Cambridge University and 1 at All Souls at Oxford University. And I understand that today Lynette will be talking and reflecting on her book, well known to many of you, I'm sure, A Little Bird Told Me, Family Secrets, Necessary Lies. So I'll hand over to you, Lynette. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. I'm going to share my screen. I'll work out how to do that. There we go. Okay, thank you. I'm hoping you can see that now. Thank you, everybody. Privileged to be part of this group today. Obviously, as ever, I begin with an acknowledgement. I think it's an important gesture because it frames all of my intellectual work. So I write and live on the unceded lands of the Kulin people of Naarm, which we now know as Melbourne, here in Victoria, Australia. Endless city of lockdowns, I must add. I consider it essential that we acknowledge everyone who's gone before us and those who have endured. It's integral to all the work that I do as an Indigenous historian. Melbourne is a modern city, but beneath its kilometres of coaxial cables and broadband cables, tons of concrete, mountains of steel, every footfall we take is Aboriginal land. The connection to that land has never been broken. It's been tested at times, undoubtedly, but it's never been broken. So it's to all of the ancestors who went before me that I respect and whom I am guided by and try to listen to. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to think again about the whole question of eugenics in Australia. Jane's really wonderful summing up there was perfect for what I'm trying to say, because it is not a concept that's not commonly applied to the way that we think about Indigenous histories. So I will just move through a couple of quick things on mine. Of course, I would have to show the same picture. I guess it's become the quintessential leitmotif of any conversation about eugenics, that extraordinary image from A.O. Neville. I do apologise, it seems a rather fuzzy copy on my computer, but I'm sure you know what I mean. The next image that I think is also worth looking at and reflecting on, and I'm sure one that Peter is very familiar with, is this astonishing image. And of course, the visuals here are really powerful, particularly the cross on the little girl's dress, the holding of toys which one suspects look very brand new and were probably put back in a box and taken off them after the photograph was taken. But the thing that really I find particularly powerful in this is, I like the handwritten note at the bottom. I like this little girl in the centre of the group, but if taken by anyone else, any of the others will do, as long as they are, and the most important word in this sentence, I think, as long as they are strong. And that's, to me, a perfect example of the kind of eugenics thinking in action. I really appreciate, Jo, you reminding us of the Sunrise scandal, and particularly the Kerry-Ann Kennelly, mostly because it rams home to us that these might appear to be historical phenomena, but they're clearly much more than that. So I would suggest that eugenic thinking can be seen in anxieties and policies around mixed race children, the fear of the half caste, segregation, protectionism, missions, the removal of children, and other forms of institutional confinement. But perhaps most obviously right now, it would be the shameful levels of incarceration that we see for Indigenous people across men and women across the country. All of these activities are designed to break connections to country, to culture, to family, to community. What I'd like to think about today is why we don't talk about eugenics quite so much, and I'm hoping later on that's where our conversation might go. When Europeans arrived in what we now know Australia, Aboriginal people started telling their stories, both within and outside of their communities. As the expert on Aboriginal literacies, Penny Van Torn, has written, as far back as 1796, Aboriginal people were recounting small segments of their lives, piecemeal, fragmentary, written forms in hundreds of handwritten letters, petitions, submissions, and to official inquiries and court testimonies. The non-Indigenous settler nation was not, however, prepared to listen for at least another 150 years. And it was the late 1970s before Aboriginal people found that there was a non-Indigenous audience for their voice, for their writing. This is when Indigenous narratives really began to emerge, often sitting uncomfortably in the genres between memoir, history, biography, and even fiction. The literary theorist Kay Schaefer observed that these became the forum for Indigenous people to speak on their own behalf, thus mediating 200 years of being spoken about. A key concern of these writings and the narratives was the removal of children from their natal families and their subsequent institutionalisation, or indeed their non-Indigenous adoption. These removals are, I argue, based on eugenic ideals about colour, and race, flecked through with notions of feeble-mindedness, laziness, fitness, and weakness. In 1997, when the statutory body of the Australian Human Rights Commission, established originally in 1986, released the Bringing Them Home report, it documented the pervasiveness of forced child removals and the effects that this had had on Aboriginal children, their families, their communities. Bringing Them Home emphasised that Indigenous narratives of our history need to be considered as a matter of urgent national concern. For the first time, non-Indigenous Australians could no longer claim that they didn't know the history, the effects and the consequences of the government's assimilationist, and I would argue perhaps eugenicist policies towards Aboriginal children, forcibly removed from their birth families between 1910 and 1970. As the report notes, in that time, not one Indigenous family has escaped the effects of forcible removal. Sadly, however, over 2 decades later, denialists, conservative commentators and the like, as we just saw, continue to claim that the removals were exaggerated and that these occurred for the child's own good. In the decade prior to the report, as Australia began to celebrate its bicentenary of European occupation, Aboriginal people began to organise political protests and assert that their stories must be heard. As the author and Aboriginal activist Ruby Langford-Ginnaby observed, audiences were hungry for authentic Indigenous narratives, most notably represented by the phenomenal success of Sally Morgan's My Place in 1987, which opened up the country, allowing Indigenous voices and experiences to be heard and acknowledged. Sally Morgan's My Place was a book that resonated with my own understandings of my family's history and its series of secrets. Deeply affected by and implicated in the colonial project, I began to research my family's Aboriginal story in 1996. At the time, I was concerned not to overclaim my Aboriginal identity or my sense of belonging. That's something that we can revisit later because, as one might imagine, over a 30-year period, that has shifted. A Little Bird Told Me is the narrative that I developed. It was really to understand the life of my Aboriginal great-grandmother, Emily, and by extension, her daughter, my grandmother, Gladys. I wrote the book ultimately for my father and for my children, but also, I have to admit, it was for myself. I would argue that most Indigenous memoir is probably similarly framed. Understanding the past in order to appreciate the present, particularly for those who choose to work in Indigenous studies and histories, is crucial. I began the research. I wanted to know why Emily and Gladys had taken such care to keep a number of secrets and maintain mistruths through the generations. One of their secrets was involved our Aboriginal heritage across the generations. We were called gypsies, then more lately the descendants of a Polynesian princess. In fact, one of my ancestors was described as a Polynesian princess in a photograph that clearly shows that she's Aboriginal. But descending from Polynesian royalty is not an uncommon trope among Indigenous people. And I've heard from several families a similar story where their ancestors had implied a Polynesian rather than an Aboriginal identity. I'm also aware of one family, it was a friend of my family, my parents, who on adopting an Aboriginal baby were in fact assured that he was Maori. For an excellent exploration of this, I'd suggest everybody have a look at Possessing Polynesians, the Science of Settler Colonial Whiteness in Hawaii by Arvin. But another secret, possibly even more shameful, was Emily's catastrophic mental breakdown and subsequent lengthy confinement. Emily was detained in a series of mental hospitals under the Mental Hygiene Act of 1933. She was for the most part an inmate at Cooloola in Sunbury. After 16 years, she was released and declared relieved. Her relationship with her daughter, my grandmother, had been irreparably broken. When she'd left, Gladys, my grandmother, was a child, and when she returned, she was a young mother, married with a son, my father. Before I began the research, I had a sort of romantic notion that Emily's madness was a bit like Polonius in Hamlet. Though this be madness, yet there's method in it. I'd entertained the idea that she might have chosen madness and insanity instead of buckling to a colonial system. None of these musings were correct, I suspect. Emily heard voices. She spoke to the spirits. She responded to them. Perhaps these were the spirits of her ancestors. The truth is, I can't know with any certainty. Those around her, her family, the medical fraternity, thought this was a pathology. And I have no idea what she thought, as her medical records are largely silent of her voice. And apart from two comments covering a 16-year period of incarceration, we only ever hear her voice twice. She was variously described as having auditory hallucinations, schizophrenia, mental breakdown, severe anxiety, psychosis, and mental collapse. At one point, in her incarceration, she refused to speak and refused to answer other than in a song. So she sang, each time they spoke to her, she sang a reply. The Little Bird Told Me was well received, mostly positively, and the reception was incredibly pleasing. The period immediately after publication saw dozens of radio interviews and invitations, almost invariably with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and local and national radio stations. ABC TV made a documentary out of it, one of their postcards from history, short documentaries. There were a range of things. Numerous Aboriginal people contacted me, often with information on the family, and some new connections were made. Some family members rejected the book outright and saw my outing myself and them as an act of betrayal. So in short, I lost family, but I was rapidly welcomed into a much bigger family of Indigenous Victoria. Shortly after publication, I ran into the luminous Lisa Belair, Aboriginal activist, poet and journalist, and much missed. Lisa and I had attended Melbourne University together. We would often chat and she would entertain my youngest son, twirling him around and dancing with him. In her usual fashion, she greeted me with warmth and humour and congratulated me on the book. This was an acknowledgement that meant a great deal to me. Lisa went on to say she saw Emily and Gladys's story as part of the stolen generation, a different version of it, but nonetheless a removed family narrative. That characterisation, which I had never considered before, was revealing. Over the next few years, I was able to use this as a lens to understand the intergenerational trauma that I had witnessed, but never comprehended. This was a trauma that, for some families, continues to the present, a trauma that, for the most part, I've been able to leave behind by researching, writing, and acknowledging the role of Emily. Having the opportunity to revisit A Little Bird Told Me is an unexpected privilege. It's a rare interlude, reflecting on previous work. The modern academy does not allow itself to slow research. I'm sure you're all aware. We are constantly pressured to produce quality outputs more and more and move on to the next project. The chance to reflect on prior work hardly ever eventuates. This process has allowed me to recalibrate the impact of that research and think deeply about the crucial way in which I do history and how writing A Little Bird Told Me grounded me and showed me my connections with the past. And it's allowed me the development of new connections and the emergence of new and different types of engagements. It's also allowed me the opportunity to think deeply about the role of eugenics in Emily's life and, of course, in the story. While I went to great lengths to preserve the anonymity of family members, leaving out surnames where I could, for the family secrets and necessary lies that I was talking about and uncovering them and bringing them to light was equally necessary. What others might have seen as a betrayal, I saw as an honouring. The question of eugenics in an Australian context is a vexed one. I see that evidence in the mixed race children, the fear of the half-caste, segregation, protection, missions, removal of children, all those stolen generations and those other forms, like Emily, institutional and confinement. And right now, as I said before, our shameful rates of incarceration of men and women. Breaking the connection to country in lots of ways was the intention of both the stolen generations, removal, I would suggest the removal of people into, many of them women, into asylums, to break that connection to country, to culture, to community. But there's something, I think, rather deliciously ironic in it too, because it was the 16 years of incarceration that produced a huge quantity of archival records that enabled me to reclaim Emily, to reclaim her life, her experiences, and ultimately her place in our lives and our family. I've always been I'm very much interested in 19th century history and earlier. And there were these two pieces, I'm just going to leave them here for the moment. I don't need to speak to them, but these two pieces from newspaper articles really, to me, sum up what was the thought processes in the late 19th century leading up to the period when Emily was admitted into the Kalula Psychiatric Asylum for her 16-year stint. And that is, Australia was a country that needed to have a better class of people, a fitter class of people, a whiter class of people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynette. Really wonderful. So I have a couple of questions for you. And actually, Warwick Anderson has posed two searching questions for the panel as a whole. You can see them, his questions there in the question and answer. What I propose is that we'll just direct more specific questions to you, Lynette, one or two we have time for. And then after Peter's presentation discussion, we'll come back to these broad questions or perhaps all have the opportunity to kind of reflect and respond to them. So if I could just start, for me, Lynette, and you've actually, I think, made this very clear today. When I read your book and listening to you now, I was really irresistibly kind of prompted to ask whether your great-grandmother's life was doubly affected by not merely being a woman, not merely being Aboriginal, but also a woman. And I just wondered, that's a kind of double whammy. So what do you think the role of intersectionality might have played in not just her life, but the lives of so many other women?
I think it's undeniable that there's a relationship between race, gender, and certainly poverty, class, the much understudied and underdiscussed concept of class in Australian society. They were dirt poor as well. They rented their entire lives. They rented a tiny little house in Brunswick. I think intersectionality is probably a really useful tool for us to start to think about how we might fragment the layers of oppression that creates any of the experiences of any of these people. I guess I'd also add in to there. I also wonder about her psychosis. I mean, her psychosis is quite potentially the result of all of these things, but also is it possible that she wasn't psychotic? She was merely talking to the spirits. And I've had many elders say to me, wow, if that's what you get locked up for, I would be locked up. So, you know, I don't know. And she never stopped talking to the spirits. And I think this is a really important thing. She may have been released after 16 years and described as relieved. But my father tells me that when he was you know, a teenager and a young adult, she would still talk to the spirits. And these were just a part of her life.
Yes, yes, really thought-provoking. Thank you. I think I'll just see if, yeah, sorry, I'm just going to manage these different boxes. I don't see any other more specific questions, but I had a couple more, but so I'll just kind of ask one. I very much like your comment about the way that these relentless, you know, the relentless scrutiny and documentation of Emily's life actually proved, you know, to be beneficial for you in coming back to try and reconnect with her. And I think, to me, that's a sort of an enduring irony of this kind of research, you know, in the wake of stolen generations, that that sort of, you know, that surveillance is actually now able to be transformed and turned upside down and becomes the means for recovery. So, and I understand that you are sort of concerned with being sucked into the vortex of family history.
Yes.
But you know, actually might be happy to do so. So I just wonder whether you could sort of respond on your experiences, I suppose, of ploughing through the archives.
Yes. It is extraordinary to be ploughing through the archive and know that you're connected to it. It's quite different to the work that we normally do, which is often, we might have an emotional connection, but this was an actual familial connection. That's terribly important. I do want to resist the vortex of family history, although it's almost irresistible. But the irony, it's absolutely true. Aboriginal communities in this country are the most surveilled people on the planet. And I guess ultimately the ironic aspect is it does enable us an archive of materials that we can go back and start to reclaim and reconnect in ways that, had we not have those archives, we would not be able to do. Of course, without those archives, we might have had the connections maintained. So it's almost like a strange feedback loop.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. So I think, keeping an eye on the time, I'm going to move on now. I'm hoping, I understand Rob has now put Warwick's fabulous questions into the general chat and the Q&A, so everyone can sort of reflect on those. I'm going to move on now, though, to Peter Reid. So just to introduce Peter, Peter started his career as a school teacher in Canberra and London, and in 1976 to 78 he was a curriculum research officer in the Northern Territory Department of Education. In 1980, Peter and Coral Edwards founded Link Up, an organisation which sought to reunite Aboriginal people who had been separated from their families by state wardship and adoption. He was the first historian to use the term stolen generations in an occasional paper entitled The Stolen Generations, The Removal of Aboriginal Children in New South Wales, 1883 to 1969. So this groundbreaking paper, published in 1982, was commissioned by the New South Wales Family and Children's Service Agency. So this is, I understand, prior to the creation of the Department of Aboriginal Affairs. And it was among the first attempts to document the devastation of forcibly removing Aboriginal children in Australia from their parents to be sent to state or church-run institutions, boarding homes, residential schools, and adoption programs. Reid concludes that it's a story of attempted genocide. His work on Aboriginal oral history began with research for his biography of the Aboriginal activist and public servant Charles Perkins in the 1980s. Professor Reid gained his PhD from ANU, where he worked for the majority of his professional life, where I met him as a student many years ago. His books include A Rape of the Soul So Profound, The Return of the Stolen Generations, published in 1990, and Haunted Earth, published in 2003. Peter is now a professor in the School of Philosophical and Historical Inquiry at the University of Sydney. So rather than present the paper, I'm going to pose a few questions to Peter, which I hope will bear on our discussion today. So first of all, Peter, I wanted to ask you, how did you become aware of the process of child removal and come to establish LinkUp and then research and write your key 1982 paper? These are at such an early time in our understanding of these histories.
Thank you, Joanne, for those kind words. Peter Reid's my name, talking to you from Monash country in Canberra, where I'd like to acknowledge our elders, past, present and future, and also, I suppose, apologise in advance for a number of offensive terms I'll probably be using at one time or another in the next quarter of an hour or so, which demean, of course, not just Indigenous people, but everybody. I hate to even talk about these things in the language and let alone the actions that were being done. But anyway, that's got to be said. So I won't apologise every time I use the word half-caste. I'll just take it as read. We're going to do that. Okay. Now the question is basically how did the Stolen Generations and LinkUp can be written, and how did Umra Edwards, she calls herself Umra Edwards now, and I began LinkUp. Well, I suppose I've done a number of interviews in the Territory in the 70s with people who've been removed in connection with other aspects of Aboriginal history in the Territory. But the interesting thing was, as I look back on it now, I reflected the attitude of the people who've been removed, which was either, well, it was a big joke, the missionaries were fools and I used to hide in the garbage tin, and weren't they silly? Or alternatively, thank you for giving us the word of God. Nobody was seeing it then as a concerted policy of putting an end to Aboriginal culture, if not part Aboriginal people. And in 1980s, when I started, early 80s, I started writing a PhD, having worked in a Rambi mission the year before. That's in Cowra, where plenty of people were taken off that, as I came to reflect afterwards, because it was a real trouble spot. One of the government stations that really annoyed the board, because the people there were so stroppy in demanding their rights all the time. And yet there's a number of more Indigenous children taken away from Rambi than you might have expected in a place which only held 80 people. Interviews that I was recording and travelling around Wiradjuri country, it tended to be rather the same, except that now hedged around with, Peter, can you help me? Look, I went into the police station several years ago and said, look, I've run out of tucker. Can you give me some? A week later, the kids have gone. What can you do to help, please? Which I had no idea. I wasn't even aware of the distinction between a state ward and adopted child, really. But I think the really significant thing is going through the records of the Aboriginal Protection Board and Welfare Boards at the State Archives in Sydney. Now, they're all closed up, have been for years. Very unfortunately, for a reason I'll mention in a minute. Now, I had permission in a general way from the Department of Aboriginal Affairs as it existed then. And they said, yeah, go to it. They had no idea what was in it. Nobody had any ideas. I mean, there's 22,000 files, mostly about individuals, and there's about several thousand just on state wards and Indigenous removals, one sort or another. And it wasn't until then I started the records that the penny really dropped, not by talking to people. That's the interesting thing. I had to read those records and see that extraordinarily offensive things that were being written there about people and why their kids should be taken away, and not much attempt to conceal what the origins of the policy were, or how it was being carried out up to 1969. So the two things came together, and Umra and I were already talking to each other. She was a trainee at the old Institute for Aboriginal Studies in Canberra, and she and I used to do a lot of visiting of various agencies of Sydney. This is in about sort of 1980, I guess, 1980, 81. And we finished up one of the places we used to visit a lot was a little organisation, part of GACS, as they used to call it, Youth and Community Services, which was investigating how children were being taken away, I think. Anyway, there's only half a dozen people in it. They said, can you put together something about the way children were being taken away? So which was the origin of the paper Stolen Generations, but was just a little Xerox thing of 20 pages. Somehow it finished up must have been in the Premier's department, who took the decision to, well, let's put together a proper little booklet, even though it doesn't have a date on it, actually. Government put us a bit slack there. Let's produce 10,000 copies and distribute them around. And interestingly, it has had quite an effect. I mean, I and various other people have been banging on about frontier violence for years. No one's taken the slightest notice. It's still don't, really. But when the issue of stolen generations took off, partly I suppose was a motherhood issue, but partly it's so many Indigenous people came to us later on and said, "Oh, was that why we were taken away? We even did a session with the old National Aboriginal Council, and Norma made a passionate speech, and I could see all the members of the National Aboriginal Council, the advisory board. Oh, really? Was that what was happening? I don't mean to diminish understanding, but it was, people didn't quite get it. Obviously, they knew their kids had been taken away, and there was an incredible amount of trauma, grief, and misery about it. But without putting it together, this was meant to happen."
Wow, that's amazing. So it kind of reminds me about debates about genocide, which sometimes turn on whether it was intentional. You know, some argue, oh no, it wasn't genocide because they didn't mean to do it. But in a way, the kind of emergence of that history and the way it was told, I seem to remember, you know, at the time of the 1997 Heriock inquiry report, some people saying, well, people didn't know about it, there was no narrative. But, you know, is that really relevant? You know, surely, you know, this was a series of policies, and we can perhaps make sense of them better using the lens of eugenics, for example, and to make sense of those Indigenous experiences. I guess, so that's probably not a very targeted question. Do you still think that process constituted genocide? And do you think that it relates to eugenics, or how do you think it might?
No, I don't use the word genocide anymore, partly because pick up Sir Ron Wilson's use of the term in bringing them home. I think he said, well, look, if you want to use that term genocide, you can. And that proved a bit of a hornet's nest and a real distraction from what the report was saying. Because there was somebody talking about what do you really mean? This can't be genocide. You know, I won't go through all that. And I found the same thing. As soon as you use that word, people want to go off in different directions instead of talking about what we're supposed to. I used to say that if Archie wrote things in relation to Russell Moore, another crime committed here was genocide, well, good luck to Uncle Archie when he's entitled to use it. I don't. Well, and there's a sort of technical reason as well, because literally, as I understand it, means the death of people. This isn't deliberate killing going on. It's, if you want to call it ethnocide, putting it into Aboriginal culture, sure, well, obviously it's that. And so in the Northern Territory, where it's pretty clear that it's not going to, you can't take everybody away. And so you're really only just focusing on the part Aboriginal people. Take the half caste, and that's written quite clearly in the records. This girl stands out. She's so white amongst her community, so obviously we've got to take her away. Kind of obvious, isn't it? Yeah. So a short answer is I don't use it, partly because it's a motive, and partly because technically it's really not correct in terms of you're actually killing people. Okay,
but that also moves closer to the definition of eugenics, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think that the colonies are different from settled Europe. I mean, I found this quote, which I thought I must bring you today. I think it's so fundamental to settler colonies, particularly in cattle lands. This is from the the words of Patrick Wolfe of revered memory. As Deborah Bird-Rose has pointed out, to get in the way of settler colonisation, all the native has to do is stay at home. And Patrick continues, whatever settlers may say, as they generally have a lot to say, the primary motive for elimination is not race or religion or ethnicity or grade of civilization, etc., but access to territory. Territoriality is settler colonialism's specific irreducible element. Yeah, well, and so in other words, we can get past Neville or get past the Australian policymaker and say, well, why is eugenic theory adopted by particularly people, particularly him, because it's a convenient argument to what a more basic purpose of colonial imperialism actually is. And again, you can see it in the several countries. In areas where, particularly cattle country, which needs a large open space, you've got pressure on land. What do you do with the people there? Taking children away is only one, actually, of a heap of tactics. The first of which, of course, is local genocide. It's killing people in small defined areas, or large areas in Queensland, but in the territory, there's local massacres going on within 20 or 50 square miles. That's just one way. Driving people onto reserves, like Palm Island, for instance, and keeping them there. It's a very common remedy, and I could name dozens in Australia which have tried that. But it's not very satisfactory if you want to apply the genetic theory of full blood, half caste, quarter caste, octoroons, 16th, and so on. Because if you keep everybody together, it doesn't work that way. You're going to get that frightful phrase, back crossing, which is applied to cattle breeding and so on. People are going to back cross all the time if you keep them in one place. So it doesn't work. Alternatively, you can drive people out. But the Victorian solution, who adopted first, men under, young people under the age of, or over the age of 30, off you go. Kids, will either keep them and educate them, or later on we'll take them away and put them in their own specific homes. That's another remedy. I mean, there's so many different tactics that I won't go on, but there's so many different tactics that one can adopt, which is all iniquitous in what they're trying to do, and all have the ultimate aim, though, of putting an end to Aboriginal, if you like, Aboriginal sociality, Aboriginal customary ways, which will be practiced particularly by people who stay on the land in their family groups, when in actually our prime imperative is to get them off the land.
Yeah, no, that's right. There's a panoply of destructive practices. Yeah, that's right. I think we can probably come back to some of those nuances as well later, but I just want to ask a final question of you, Peter, before we move on, which is, given your groundbreaking role at the beginning of our understanding of this history, and the fact that you're still working and engaging and producing, these insights into it now, could you just reflect briefly on the kind of changes in Aboriginal, but also mainstream views that you have seen since you began working in this domain?
Yeah, well, if you take it back to early 70s, you've got people like Charlie Perkins writing Mark Tucker, writing their biographies of how we came to be taken away. It's really not till probably when Barbara Cummins wrote her book, If Everybody Cared, and she's really beginning to encapsulate the reasons why we were removed. I think the biggest change now is we accept that it happened, first of all. We accept that it happened for, or some of us accept that it happened for malevolent reasons. We've now got it institutionalised in the secondary school curriculum. And to have that such a big and iniquitous element of the history of this country included in the school curriculum, I'm not sure what justifications they give for why kids are removed, but certainly within the curriculum now, is a major achievement compared to so many other aspects of our Indigenous history which aren't on the curriculum, which probably never will be. that. So I think that's the biggest change. We now understand that there was many thousands of children moved, and then they were for a variety of purposes, and we can now sit back and say this is what's happening. Whether it's still happening or not, another question. We won't go into that now, but it's still been institutionalized as something worthy of study, and we can respect it as an element of our history now, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and I take your point that we accept that it happened for malevolent reasons, so it wasn't really a benign, well-intentioned policy. Can I just ask two sort of more specific questions, which are, first of all, what are the issues that you don't think will be included in the school curriculum? And also, earlier in your talk, you referred to the problem of the closed archives. I wonder whether you could, you said you were going to explain why that's a problem.
Okay. The first thing is what? What was the first? Sorry, what was the first question?
What is not in the school curriculum that you never did?
Oh yeah. Well, if you think of the extraordinary violations of human rights that took place on mission stations and government stations up till about 1980, there's a lot of books on the subject, heaps and heaps. People writing reminiscences and describing, we look through the legislation, see what punitive legislation there was. And yet, all that, the treatment of people on government reserves and stations is equally iniquitous part of our history. I don't think there's anything in the school curriculums except to say perhaps Aboriginal people were driven onto reserves where they stayed there. We've probably lost the no, I think that's one of the most important ones. Violence is too contested really to make its way back into the curriculum. If you consider that Professor Lynn Ryan's work, she thinks there'll be about 450 massacre sites listed finally. It's very contentious, and that will be no more than probably a discussion point in the school curricula in the near future. And I think, and I've told Lyndall myself, look, the work that Joanne and I did in the territory, being told massacres, and we're the only people who'd heard it, and we're the only evidence providers in a number of places in the territory on her map there, shows you how many were, we don't have records and never will. They're just lost because they were people talking in the 1970s, and their children only have the vague idea of what was happening. So the most violent element of our history, and that the government stations, I think, is the other history that they'll never make it really into the school curriculum. In this generation, at least, I wouldn't say that's never going to.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
In terms of what's happening today, well. You're right. About even the 1980s, there were questions raised about compulsory sterilisation of women in the outback, which were never entirely put to rest. And I remember, I can say this publicly because Joy Williams made it public. Joy Williams was Joy Janica Williams, a Wiradjuri woman who sued the state for wrongful removal back in the late 1990s, and lost the case actually. I'm sure she wouldn't lose it now, but she did then. And she was taken away from her mum, Doretta. And when she reunited with Doretta Williams, Doretta said, "Look, I gave birth to you in the late 40s, and then I formed a relationship later on, and I went back to the doctor and said, how come I can't get pregnant now?" The doctor did an examination. "Don't you realise you haven't got a womb, Doretta?" It was obviously taken out during a Caesar when Joy was born. How common was that? God knows. I really have no idea. And this is late 40s, and in Sydney, in Crown Street Hospital. Uma and I, on several occasions, were asked to investigate people who came to us and said, "I think my child or my sister, or aunties came, my niece, we were told she had died in hospital. Did she really? We investigated a number of those cases, always draw blank, not least because hospital records are a bit vague for one reason or another. That is to say, they're if you're a stillborn baby, you may or may not get a birth certificate. That's what we were told. Well, that sounds like a medicine of bungling, which you expect in country hospitals. But also, of course, it's exactly the same. That's exactly what you would do if you want to remove a child from a mother, particularly if she was unconscious for a time. When the baby was born, you'd say, I'm sorry, the baby's died, and he doesn't have a birth certificate because we don't give them. That's exactly what you would do. I suppose we get more and more suspicious. Black fellows around the country are innately suspicious. I've learned to be highly suspicious of everybody. The state government under New South Wales legislation at the moment gives the right to people, to stolen generations, people to make claims upon compensation against the state government for $70,000 only if you're removed under the Aboriginal Protection Act. But more than half the state wards in New South Wales were actually removed under different legislation. Was that an accident that the framers of the Act, because they didn't know enough history and wrote it like that? I don't put anything past anybody these days.
No, right. Oh, that also responds to my earlier question, I guess, about the transformation of people's views over time. And I'd also just note there that there was an inquiry in 2013 commissioned by the Australian Senate into the forced sterilisation of women with disabilities, which, right. And I believe the campaign continues. Rob others may have more information, but the campaign continues because we lack positive legislation outlawing those practices. So this is still an open case.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you very much, Peter. That's really amazing, to hear that from you. Just keeping an eye. Just trying to keep an eye on time. I know we're over time. So what I'll propose is that I will pose Warwick Anderson's 2 questions for everyone to respond to, and then we will go to the breakout rooms that Lucia and Rob will be organising. So thank you very much, Warwick. Warwick says, an excellent and timely panel. I have 2 questions for all panellists. First of all, when I wrote Cultivation of Whiteness 20 years ago, Tim Rouse asked me how Australian policies differed from those in Aotearoa and North America. What might be distinctive about Indigenous eugenic theory and practice in Australia? And he says, I don't have an answer, but I would like one. So would anyone like to respond to that?
Can I probably just say that my understanding, particularly this has actually come through Rob's work, reading Rob's book and also the terrific documentary that he was involved in. And that is, there seems to be the North American, Canada and the US seem to have a more explicit sense of it being a eugenics movement, where it's in Australia, it's a little, it seems a bit sort of more like a subterfuge. No one ever says clearly, we're going to do this, we're going to sterilise, or we're going to, people might hint at it, but it never becomes a policy the way in some states of America, and of course in Canada with what Rob's work has shown. It never becomes that actual entrenched formal policy.
And I think Stephen Dalton and others have, pointed to what he terms the limits of a liberalism in terms of eugenics in Australia generally, and argued that it, in fact, it lacks the purchase that it had in other countries. But my response is to say, Peter has just pointed to these various, these widespread and diverse practices directed toward Aboriginal people. So so clearly it's one part of this wider platform. Peter, did you want to respond to that? Joanne?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about that question of the differences between the kind of, I guess, the forums in which these kind of policies were made. And yeah, as Lynette said, it wasn't as explicit, but when you look at A.O. Neville's kind of book, Australia's Coloured Minority, which is written in the late 40s. So it's kind of, eugenics is kind of getting on the nose there in terms of that language. And yeah, as Jane said, there wasn't as much of an emphasis on the improvement of population of the gene pool. It was really focused on race and whitening. And the way in which he frames it is it's to address racism of white Australians. So because white Australians won't, he sees, you know, to use the language, half castes and quarter castes as more, like they are assimilable, but white Australians are too racist to accept them. So we have to kind of enact this program. And you know, he's kind of the most vehement proponent. Like you can kind of sense his frustration that his policies aren't enacted consistently. But yeah, more opportunity, kind of use of eugenic language.
I suppose in Australia we have so many reasons for removing half-caste kids that, in a sense, the eugenics argument, which is right, as far as I understand it, running out of steam a bit by the First World War. I mean, the most common reason, I guess, there's two in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. There's either for the good of the child, we know all about that, but also for our own good. And the uprising of a wild race of half-castes is something you hear in the South in the perhaps 1880s, 1890s, but it's much more explicit in the territory in the 1930s. I mean, we're taking the kids away for our good. We're being outnumbered here. And unless we get the girls into domestic service, because the Commonwealth government won't unfortunately allow us to have Asian servants, but unless we get the boys back working properly on cattle stations, we're going to be in trouble. Now, Cecil Cook pushed that argument a lot. Whether he really believed it as fervently as he pretended to, it's a bit of a question for debate. But he certainly had the ear of Black Jack McEwen, as Minister for Territories, in trying to stiffen up the Northern Territory legislation generally. And that was a pretty good lever to get people to work. So in a sense, there's so many reasons why urging governments to remove Indigenous kids, in a sense, your eugenic motivation is only one amongst quite a few, and not necessarily the most convincing if you're living on the ground in the cattle lands.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.